virus has not stopped in pandemic but simply changed forms. This pandemic exposed them to additional risks and challenges, leaving many consequences for their social inclusion.
انقطاع الرواتب حمل المرأة أعباء كثيرة دفعتها إلى البحث عن مصدر دخل مقابل عائد مادي زهيد ولساعات عمل طويلة في ظل المجتمع اليمني المحافظ الذي يمنع المرأة من العمل خارج المنزل خاصة في المناطق الريفية.
COVID-19 has left consequences for mental health, and the omnipresent ethno-nationalism, chauvinism, war inciting messages additionally affect the increased aggressions in all interpersonal relationships.
C'est une province affectée par les conflits armés, par les éruptions.
It's a province affected by armed conflict, by
épidémie d'Ebola, et aujourd'hui, elle constitue le deuxième épicentre de Covid-19 en RDC. C'est aussi une province sous l'état de siège où les juridictions civiles ont été remplacées par les juridictions militaires. Ce contexte est si difficile.
This difficult context affects the life, the economy, the well-being, and even the mobility of women and girls.
Nous avons réalisé plusieurs activités. Là-dedans, nous avons fait distribution matérielle à kits sanitaires pour faire prévention contre Covid. Nous avons supporté les autorités locales dans l'action prévention contre Covid. Nous avons réalisé plusieurs activités avec Tifio Lakayo.
SIHA contributed smartphones to connect women with each other and share key information during the heights of the pandemic.
We have been able to continue to offer logistical support, to conduct online trainings on WhatsApp platforms, and implement activities concurrently in all districts.
Physicians for Human Rights aims to ensure that more survivors of sexual violence have access to survivor-centered medical care, and this includes forensic documentation services.
En Haïti, rares sont les organisations de la société civile qui travaillent avec les familles.
In Haiti, few civil society organizations work given their deterioration situation in this crisis. It's more than duty for ID to continue to support them.
Han dejado un esfuerzo para que las beneficiarias principales del proyecto puedan formarse como orientadoras legales comunitarias a través de capacitaciones tanto presenciales como virtuales.
Nowadays, education is power. This is something that women and girls need to actually take and have it in their hands, because it is actually going to protect them and guide them through every place they go to.
To foreground the voices of the most marginalized amongst us, it is important to invest in women and survivor-led grassroots organizations who are at the front line of the fight against gender-based violence.
Institutions and international donors should increase resources for women's organizations to address gender and psychological dimension of COVID-19. We need to give survivors voice and power also amid this invisible conflict.
I hope you have found this video as inspiring and uplifting as I have. A true testimony to the life-saving work of our partners, whose tireless activism, passion, and expertise we are all deeply grateful for. On this high note, let me officially open this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, and possibly good evening to you all. I am Abigail Erickson, the Chief of the UN Trust Fund, and I am pleased to welcome you and really thank you for joining the UN Trust Fund's webinar today. We are holding this webinar in a hybrid format, so we have some people in person for the participants who are in town to attend the first post-COVID in-person CSW 67, as well as online for those who were not able to travel to New York at this time. Today, we have the opportunity to bring partners together in a conversation about the critical role of civil society and women's rights organizations on addressing violence against women and girls in the context of protracted, complex, and overlapping crises. As we all know, the global landscape has been increasingly marked by sudden and drastic changes in our context. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic and other disruptive events, including conflict, climate change-induced natural disasters, and other political instabilities. We know this impacts women and girls in their organizing in so many ways. The compounding effect of overlapping crises has further exacerbated pre-existing gender inequalities and increased the experiences and risks of all forms of violence against women and girls. It has increased risks and threats of all forms of violence and has shrunk civic spaces and increased the pushback on women's rights globally. The UN Trust Fund has been navigating these rapidly changing contexts across 70 countries and territories together with our 186 partner organizations that we are currently working with. We have witnessed firsthand and extensively documented their inspiring resilience and agency in the face of adversity. We know that women's rights organizations are the first responders for women and girl survivors and are at the very forefront of response and prevention efforts across all contexts and all the time. As a funder of women's organizing, we have also witnessed the importance of providing flexible and long-term funding to autonomous women's rights organizations and movements as a key strategy for achieving transformational change at local, regional, and global levels. We at the Trust Fund deeply recognize that the investment has to go beyond project-based funding and towards strengthening the organizational resilience and building the preparedness systems that capitalize on the value of women's rights organizations' expertise. We hope that today's dialogue will contribute to the acknowledgement and the increased visibility of the essential role that civil society and women's rights organizations play across the humanitarian, peace, development nexus, and that their stories of resistance may inspire more strategic investments in resourcing their expertise and critical work. On this note, it is my great pleasure to hand over the virtual mic to my colleague, Lorna Messina, who will moderate today's webinar. Thank you. Over to you, Lorna.
Thank you so much, Abby, for setting the stage for all of us today. Greetings from New York, everyone. My name is Lorna Messina, and I am the Arab States Portfolio Manager for the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. I also oversaw the special window focused on women and girl refugees and IDPs. We've got a great conversation lined up for you today. Before we dive in though, there are just a quick heads up for those joining us online. There are 3 items I have to remind you about. You are all on mute to minimize audio hiccups during the presentation, but don't worry, you can still use the chat and the Q&A functions to chime in with your comments and questions, which we will get into in the final 20 minutes of this event. And second, please note that this event is being recorded and may be used for external communications purposes by the UN Trust Fund. And finally, if you want to keep the conversation going after the event, we're live tweeting it as well. You can find us at UN Trust Fund Evol on Twitter. Okay, so now we got that out of the way. We are going to go into the meat of the matter. Today's conversation is all about the critical role of civil society and women's rights organizations in situations that are marked by sudden disruptions and prolonged crisis, or what we call protracted crisis. We will be taking a close look at how the UN Trust Fund has been supporting women's rights organizations and civil society organizations in providing much needed services to survivors of violence, especially in contexts where their needs are too often overlooked. But also to ensure a focus on civil society organizations, our main partners through which the UN Trust Fund works, we will be engaging directly with some of our partners to understand the nature of the crisis from their own lens. Since 2016, the UN Trust Fund has been managing a special funding window that focuses on refugee and forcibly displaced women and girls in humanitarian crisis and fragile settings. And to date, we have supported 18 civil society-led projects under this portfolio for a total of $7.2 million. These projects have primarily focused on community prevention and response to violence against women and girls, providing coordinated and multi-sectoral services to survivors or those at risk of violence. Between 2017 and 2021, these projects reached at least 127 women and girls, refugee or internally displaced women and girls. That is indeed not a small feat for these organizations, especially in the challenging context that they all work in. And today we're lucky to have representatives from the organizations that partner with the UN Trust Fund in this cohort. We have learned so much from them through their implementation of the UN Trust Fund supported projects. We have with us today in person, Hala Al-Karib, who is the Regional Director of SIHA, or Strategic Initiatives for the Horn of Africa. They implemented a project in South Sudan, which already finished, but they are implementing a project right now in Somalia, supported by the UN Trust Fund. We also have with us in person today, Kevin Schumacher, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Women for Afghan Women. They also just recently finished a project that was implemented in 4 provinces in Afghanistan. And finally, we have joining us remotely, Lisette Garcia, who is an asylum specialist lawyer with the Instituto para las Mujeres en la Migración, or IMUMI, and the organization is based in Mexico. Okay, so thank you all for being here today. Let's get this conversation started. The entire cohort of the portfolio on focus today work under some form of crisis. Let's start by having our panelists speak about their own forms of the crisis as they see it. So Hala, I will start with you. Can you give us a sense of the crisis context that you were operating in your projects? Perhaps talk about some of the overlapping issues that you and your team are grappling with. We know that the Horn of Africa has been besieged by many problems for many years now. Please.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm quite honored and great appreciation to the UN Trust Fund for enabling the feminist and the women organizations to continue to work under such difficult circumstances, and to give the women activists on the ground a voice and the space to be part of the humanitarian response to crisis. Long time ago, when I started working in this field, it was a struggle, for organizations that works on violence against women to find their place during crisis situations, because sexual and gender-based violence were not perceived as an emergency humanitarian crisis. So, we came a long way, and, we continue to be grateful for the collaborations and the space. So, it's the Horn of Africa region is a very complex region. It's a region that has been in crisis for the past, I would say, 40 years, and it's a renewed cycles of crisis. And, this crisis has been most of the time manifested and reflected on the status of women and on the prevalence of violence against women and girls. Having said that, that's only half of the of the glass. There is another, the other part of the glass that's filled is the fact that the women movement has came a long way in the region. So, so despite the oppressions and the polarization and the conflicts, I'm really proud of the fact that the women movements in the region is showing great resilience, strength, and commitments, and an understanding that the stability of the region is largely connected and linked to the commitments to women human rights and to ending all forms of violence against women. And this is mostly becoming our discourse and narrative across the regions at the national level. So when we sit with actors, when we sit with governments, we tell them, violence against women is the national issue. Violence against women is not a peripheral issue. Is not something that you deal with it on the side. It's a central issue. It's linked to militarism. It's linked to economies. It's linked to all kinds of failed governance that we are struggling with across the region. So on that's one side of the problems. On the other hand, as feminist organization and women organization, we also struggle with the challenges of maintaining our own existence and presence within such a difficult and complex ecosystem. The region is not an easy place to exist. Safety and security for the activists and of the women organizations is a real thing, something that we have to navigate every day. The feminist movement, the women organizations are not supported by the overall environment. So it's a struggle. And we have to be strategic, and we have to navigate our existence. The civil space is also, highly problematic. We are struggling with shrinking civil space. There is, over regulations that specifically targets women organizations and feminist groups. For example, many of our networks, they have to register on annual basis to sustain their existence. So it's in addition to the struggle of accessing resources and funding as well. So there is multiple layers of a struggle that we are dealing with, in addition to the fact that we have to cope, with different crisis situation that keeps occurring across the region. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Hala, and for explaining the complex situation that the SIHA has been operating in for these last, I think, 20 or 30 years, right? SIHA has been operating. Lisette, I'm now going to go to you. Hala mentioned a lot of the issues that negatively impact the capacity of women's rights organizations, not only to implement projects but also to join women's movement because of these shrinking space, because of safety and security issues that she mentioned, and the linkages between military and economy, and all, it's really very complex. So I just wanted to inquire from you, Lisette, do these challenges that Hala mentioned resonate with you? How is your situation in Mexico similar or different in terms of the crisis that you have to work around?
Hola, muy buenos días a todos. Me da mucho gusto poder compartir.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be sharing with you the work we have been doing in Mexico. We have been working with women and girls trying to strengthen protection measures offered in Mexico. We work with girls and women from Honduras, Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, mainly, but we also have families who are from Afghanistan and Ukraine. What happens in the case of Mexico is that these people already come from very complex settings, from countries that have dictatorship ruling, and also persecution in terms of gender. So when they get to Mexico, they require international protection. And it's difficult here because Mexico has high levels of violence, and people's immigrant rights are regulated, but they're not so clear and not so much respected by the authorities. So in Mexico, we find a lack of safe spaces. We have a law for refugees and political asylum, and that establishes that every person that suffers gender-based violence in their countries, they could require this asylum. But these articles in the law are not really considered by the Mexican government office that analyzes the requirements. So what we do to strengthen the safety measures is to look for safe spaces where women can wait for as long as necessary for their asylum, and then we can offer psychological and other kinds of support. And we also teach them about rights access, especially in the southern border, where it's more difficult to find education, housing, and work.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for sharing with us some of the issues that are faced by your organization in trying to assist women and girls who are seeking asylum in Mexico. And now we're going to move on to Kevin. Kevin, Women for Afghanistan women's experience has also been challenging in Afghanistan. Can you talk about perhaps the series of events that unfolded during the implementation of your project and how they affected your implementation?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lona. I would like to start by offering my sincere thanks to UN Trust Fund for giving us this opportunity so that we can implement a meaningful project that touched upon thousands of lives in northern region of Afghanistan. I also would like to remind everybody that unfortunately, hundreds of my colleagues in Afghanistan are dealing with a situation where the authorities are the primary violators of women's rights in that country and are engaged in systematic violations of their basic and inalienable rights. So with that said, I would like to briefly talk about the work that has been done over the past 3 years and mention some of the challenges that our colleagues are facing. We have over 30 people who are part of the UN Trust Fund funded project in Afghanistan, primarily working in 3 provinces, dealing with refugee returnees and internally displaced individuals. These are the population that are most vulnerable and are most likely exposed to domestic violence or have survived cases of domestic violence. So the way that our team has been working over the past few years, they have been divided into groups offering different kinds of services in order to empower those marginalized population, engaging in psychological counseling, legal counseling, and also providing skill training so that they can become economically independent, and also trying to provide social awareness about cases of domestic violence. What happened was that in August of 2021, halfway through the project, the Taliban took over the country and they stopped all the legal services that were provided. We used to provide sort of referrals of clients to shelters where survivors of domestic violence could be protected. And also we had counseling centers where the family could go there and provide basically sort of a series of sessions so that the family can reunite and go back and resume their normal lives. All of that ended when the Taliban came to power. They assumed that Afghanistan is now free of any form of domestic violence, and they requested all centers that were dedicated to empower women to immediately cease their operations, including our facilities. And I especially would like to thank UN Trust Fund because they have been among the most understanding and supporting funders that we ever worked with. They, throughout the project, when our colleagues needed to be evacuated, they really provided some financial support. When there was a time that for a period of several months between August and November of 2021, we had to temporarily halt our operation. UN Trust Fund was very patiently working with us and making sure that our female colleagues are being supported while we're trying to negotiate a way out of that crisis. And even now that we are trying to wrap up the project, the UN Trust Fund has been very supportive and understanding of our work. So I just want to express my gratitude to such a deep level of cooperation and partnership. Briefly, I just want to talk about the impact of the project that we had. Over the course of this project, we had over 3,800 survivors of domestic violence have been basically served, including over 2,900 women and 800 children. That was in the form of either services such as dignity kits or medical services, or providing school kits for children so that they can basically have the opportunity to attend the school. Many of these families are extremely financially disadvantaged, so they really do not have the means even to make a doctor visit or to basically provide for the basic educational and stationaries for their children. I also would like to mention another part of the outreach that our team has been engaged in, that is the vocational and life skill training. That is extremely important because, again, we do not want the beneficiaries to be in a situation that they continuously receive support. We provided them with opportunities so that they can learn new skills and eventually they can stand on their own feet. 900 survivors of domestic violence managed to go through those classes, and through that, they were able to increase their income by 25 to 35%, which has a lasting impact on the entire family. Also, I just wanted to mention that while we were able to provide referrals to our clients, we were able to refer 68 survivors of gender-based violence to shelters and family protection centers. Last thing I want to mention is the fact that right now there are 95%, based on the surveys that we have done, 95% of our beneficiaries are still interested in being engaged in our services and work with our teams. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, the Taliban in December 2022 banned all female staff from working, so severely limited the ability of female staff to be able to reach out to the clients and provide their life-saving services. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for that. It just shows how important multi-sectoral projects, holistic projects are necessary for projects on ending violence against women. You mentioned, the legal, the health, and especially the economic side of the components of the project, which was really important. Thank you to all three of you for sharing the complexities you've had to maneuver around to do your work towards ending violence against women and girls in your particular context. It would now be interesting, Kevin touched on some of them actually, but it would be very interesting to hear what has helped you along while you were implementing your project. Given what has been shared so far, what kind of specific support was most helpful in your situation, Hala and Lisette, and Kevin also, if you have anything to add later on. What has allowed you to adapt to the challenges you were faced with? And we're also interested in understanding where you found this support. Which actor did you find supported you? Please go ahead.
So I strongly believe in the power of solidarity and networking that the women organization on the ground have. I think there is an echo. If someone, yeah. So sorry for that. Yeah. So I think the issue of solidarity. There is an echo. Yeah. Can you mute? Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I think the fact that the women activists on the ground, they are the biggest supporters of our work. If we don't have support and connections to grassroots women, and their leadership and their understanding of the work and the support that we are receiving from the trust fund, and the partnership in the development of the concepts of the projects that we are engaging in, whether that's being in the previous years in South Sudan or in Somalia at the moment. Most of our work and interventions is being developed in partnership with grassroots women organizations on the ground. And that's so critical and important, because when we're doing this work, it's really important to understand the fact that women are not victims, and to respect the agency of the women. And we have been having conversations among our networks, that which term we should be using when it comes to women who are living, in extreme conflict and post-conflict situations. And we're thinking if survivors is the appropriate term. So lately we have been using, women who are who has the interest in change, and that's really we felt that term, it has it gives a lot of dignity and support and agency, to the women on the ground. So we leadership, in the interventions and decision making in leading the process has supported us a lot by the women at the grassroots level and women in the ground. Collaboration also with local governments, it's very, very important. And based on our experience, local governments being part of the communities that's are largely affected by the conflict, by the disasters, are genuinely interested most of the time, as opposed to national governments who might oppose, and have oppositions against programs that aims at changing policies and laws. But so the collaboration with local governments through the support of our local networks, the capacity to negotiate and find ways to engage with local governments. So those has been, one of the great things that we were able to cultivate through the support from the trust fund. And I think the support that we receive from the trust funds, it gives us that space. And, the design of the programs that we have, it take into considerations, also the elements of intersectionality and the elements that, and the fact that women are, and women activists, they are existing in that ecosystem, and they struggle in so many layers and at so many levels. So we were able to accommodate that within our project, and to a large extent, this is what enabled our, to a large extent, our success and influence, on the ground.
Thank you, Hala. You touched on a lot of things over there. For example, that activists exist in the whole intersectionality of women, right? So, the women and girls who are disabled, women and girls who are refugees and IDPs, and all the other, intersectionalities of a woman, right? And so, and I agree with you that, I've also seen it a lot with solidarity with local networks, with grassroots organizations is also very important. And of course, the collaboration with local government, rather than being disruptors, you are able to collaborate. Oh, speak louder. Okay, so maybe the microphone. Sorry. Is it okay? Should I repeat everything I said? I'm sorry, my microphone was not working properly. But thank you very much, Hala, for that. And now I think the same question for Lisette. Would you like to come in, Lisette? Let me know if you want me to repeat the question.
Sí. Bueno, pues el apoyo específico.
The specific support that we were able to get was through the Trust Fund, and it was thanks to this support that we were able to create a psychological legal team to support women and girls. And what this means is that the lawyer and the psychologist have an initial contact with the women, and we try to identify urgent situations that may be a matter of safety, security, health. And once we resolve these urgent situations, then we are in a position to provide much more formal legal support and advice and start an asylum process. Psycho-legal support is important because, as we know, gender-based violence has a significant impact, and it's in addition to any violence that these women may be subjected to as they travel through Mexico. So it's very important for them to get the necessary strength to tell their story to Mexican authorities, but they should also be able to identify violence through a sustained therapeutic process. They can develop the tools they need to be able to seek help, to be able to identify these patterns of violence. And through legal support, we can help with their asylum process, but also help them develop the tools to be able to learn about their rights in Mexico and live a life free of violence. In addition to individual care, individual services through the Trust Fund, we provide workshops for women and girls along the US-Mexico border and the Mexico-Guatemala border. In these workshops, we also did very interesting exercises to identify things having to do with violence in Mexico and in their countries of origin. We also emphasized very strongly the importance of mental health, and we were able to provide with this project feminine hygiene kits to the women and some specific supports to the shelters. The Trust Fund also allowed us to make a change to the project, so we were able to use additional funds to respond to the impact of the COVID pandemic. And with these funds, we were able to provide, in addition to the hygiene kits, we were able to give them cell phones so that the women may keep track of do their therapy through video calls or regular phone calls and be in contact with lawyers with those phones.
Thank you very much, Lisette. Kevin, I don't know if you touched a little bit on your response earlier about the support that you've received. So I don't know if did you want to add anything? Or?
Yes, thank you. I just want to add a few things to what I mentioned briefly. One issue that is extremely important under the current political climate in Afghanistan is the fact that the de facto authorities in the country are extremely annoyed by even the name women, right? I cannot tell you how many times they've come to us and they even ask us to change the name of the organization. So even the name is troublesome for these people. And I think the importance of international solidarity, the fact that there is a strong stance by the international partners about the issue of women's rights, and the fact that the people who are working on promoting women's rights should be protected sends a strong signal. I've seen a lot of UN agencies have been engaged in conversations with the authorities in Afghanistan, but at the same time continue to pay the salaries of female staff who were forced to stay home. I think this is such a beautiful act of disobedience, basically sending the message to the authorities that we don't care what you think about women. Women are part of the society, and you have to accept them as a very productive segment of the civil society, and you have to treat them as such. And I think the fact that even with the UN Trust Fund, we have seen this, the support that it has been given to our female colleagues, the support that has been given in terms of being creative. How do we want to deal with a situation where many female staff are not even allowed to go to the field? Well, let's try to do, a remote. If there is a phone conversation, let's try that. If there are conversations that can be carried by male staff, let's try that. Let's try to come up with creative ways to basically continue the mission. But I think it is important to keep reminding the Taliban that they cannot wish women away from the society. These people cannot change the destiny of half of the population and force them into the kitchens and to the bedrooms. And we have to continue being there strongly, even though that means being silent, but at least that presence, I think, sends the message. And I also, lastly, I want to mention a few days ago to commemorate the International Day of Women, there was a panel discussion, and I really want to appreciate the young women's representative in Afghanistan, Allison, who went so bravely to the TV, a private TV channel, and just talked about women's rights. And it was so annoying to the Taliban, but at the same time so empowering to millions of women who didn't have the voice in the society. And this, just that shows the power of international solidarity and how we can work together to basically strengthen the message of women's presence in the society and their rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin, for that very impassioned statement. So we have 5 more minutes left for this panel. So I had more questions, but because of the time, we'll do a quick go around the table. And I'm just going to ask all of you one question, and that is, if you have a priority action that one actor you interact with could prioritize to help you in your organization to be more prepared for crisis, what would that be priority, and who would that actor be?
Well, that's such a difficult and one actor. I think what's really most important is the investments on the women activists themselves, because none of us would be able to pursue this type of work, if we don't have women who has a strong agency on the ground and were able to navigate this complex environment, and to negotiate for their rights. And so that's really very, very important. I think the one actor, in my view, will be the women organizations and will be the grassroots women networks who are functioning on the ground under such difficult circumstances, because I mean, that's the core. That's a core issue. That's a core, kind of movement that we need to be able to continue this complex work. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Hala. Kevin?
I want to second Hala. I think you're absolutely right, Hala. I think the issue is we are dealing with a core group of extremely courageous and very competent women rights activists who are being pressured day in and day out. And in a lot of societies, including Afghanistan, they try to intimidate them, they try to erase them, they try to force them out of the society so that the society does not have any agents of change. And I think the solidarity and support of these women is so very important, because at the end of the day, these are the people who can create change on a social level, on a local level. And that's why the governments know that. They know that if they target these elements of change, hopefully they can interrupt or totally stop the change from happening. So I want to thank Hala for raising that, because I really believe that empowering local activists is the most important way we can basically invest in a social transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lisette, maybe you want to come in?
Sí, comparto lo que dicen mis compañeros.
Yes, and I share what the other panelists have said. Talking about women empowerment is so necessary. What we're trying to do in Mexico is for women who seek asylum and refugees can demand their rights. So yes, these processes are very interesting and quite timely. We also feel that another important actor for us to be able to continue working is, of course, the UN Trust Fund. As an organization, that connection with the Trust Fund has been so important. It has allowed us to have spaces like this one, where we get to share and we get to hear what other organizations working with the Trust Fund are doing and the perspective of women in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisette. And thank you very much for to all of you for the generosity of your time and sharing your thinking about this morning with us about this topic. And we believe, the UN Trust Fund believes, of course, in women's rights organizations and civil society organizations, and that's why we are committed. We are in the grant making business, and we really want to support projects that are demand driven and put forward by women's rights organizations and civil society organizations. So this has not only been a thought-provoking, but also, I'm hoping, an action-provoking discussion. Sadly, this is all the time that we have, but we did perfect, right on the dot. It's 10:15. And this brings me to the next part of the program, which is a sharing of ideas, now from 2 studies commissioned by the UN Trust Fund. In 2022, the UN Trust Fund commissioned not 1, but 2 studies to get a better understanding of what's been working and what needs improvement. The first study was a meta-synthesis, a way of looking at the results achieved through the special funding window. And the goal was to draw some generalizable lessons on what has worked and why, so we can do even better in the future. But that's not all. The second study, we commissioned another study, and that was even broader. It looked at the bigger picture of the humanitarian development peace nexus, or what we call, I'm sure you know, the HDP nexus, and the funding landscape. The UN Trust Fund wanted to get a handle on where our added value sits in this context, and we are very grateful that the two consultants who helped us with the report are here with us today. We are very grateful that Erin and Marta, who lend their expertise in this research, are here to break it all down for us. Erin Stern is next online. She's here to present the early findings of the study that she did. So I hand it over to you, Erin.
Thank you so much, and it's such a privilege to be here among all of you today. So as kind of Lorna introduced, I'll be sharing some preliminary findings of a synthesis review of the UN Trust Fund's special window that targeted ending violence against women and girls who are refugees and are forcibly displaced. This will be something shared within the few months, so happy to be sharing the kind of initial insights. Next slide, please. So just in terms of a background and what we've really following what we've been talking about, there's a lot of evidence of the ways in which women and girls who are refugees and are forcibly displaced are at much higher risk of experiencing gender and sexual-based violence. And this comes at an unprecedented level of global forced displacement, particularly we think over the last 1 to 5 years. So despite this high need and this vulnerability, there's also a gap in evidence around what works and how to prevent violence against refugee or forcibly displaced women and girls. So this synthesis review, I think, does 2 things. I think it really importantly summarizes insights and takes stock of this portfolio, and it's a very good moment to do so. But I also think it helps contribute to the broader gap in evidence. And it does this by summarizing insights from 13 grantees, including some of those that we've just heard from, that were funded between 2016 and 2022 through this special window on ending violence against women and girls who are refugees and or forcibly displaced. Next slide, please. So in terms of the methodology of this synthesis review, it took a qualitative meta-synthesis approach, really appreciating how the sum of kind of similar themes across 13 different projects can be greater than the individual parts. So what are some common elements that came up from this diversity of projects across many different settings, but all of which had the primary intention of ending violence against this subgroup? The review also really tried to elevate and draw on practitioner insights. And, we've just heard from some of these really rich insights around implementing programs from the perspectives of women's rights organizations and civil society organizations in different contexts, and trying to really elevate and learn from that. So what was done was there was a thematic analysis done of grantees monitoring reports. So these are the reports that grantees submit to the UN Trust Fund on an annual basis, and as well as a final project report. And for those that had end-line evaluations available, these were also included as part of the analysis, so external end-line evaluations. And then some qualitative interviews and focus groups were also conducted with grantee representatives as a form of data collection and also to validate some of the themes that have been synthesized that I'll be speaking to today that came up in this report. Next slide, please. I wanted to give an overview of the projects included. So there have been 18 projects, as Lorna mentioned, funded as part of this window. We did not include all 18 in the synthesis review. There's only 13 represented, but we did make sure that every country where this special window has funded projects was represented. And it's a diverse, settings. It's, some are much more humanitarian crisis settings. Some are maybe post-emergency or transit or host country settings. So we really have a diverse portfolio, diverse types of organizations represented as part of this learning. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share the report has an analysis came up with 5 different key findings, and I'll just share some very brief highlights to make sure I'm within time. A lot of one key finding was the importance of thinking about how to target primary and secondary beneficiaries and partners when working with this group. So across multiple projects, there was a lot of a discussion around the particular barriers for refugee or displaced women and girls to engage with projects, even if they were, and they were for all of these projects, the target beneficiaries. So thinking about things, some of the barriers could include language, literacy levels, childcare commitments, competing priorities, particularly things around ensuring livelihoods. And this came up very strongly in the COVID pandemic, sometimes less likely to have access to IT or be able to communicate remotely. So for all of these projects, the primary beneficiaries were women and girls who are displaced or refugees, but it was really critical in many settings to also think about how to engage host communities. And this was especially important to minimize the risk of backlash or stigma against refugee or displaced women and girls. Another group commonly discussed across the projects was how to engage men and boys for various reasons, including that to really address the underlying causes of violence against women and girls, you need to include men and boys. Many projects were trying to work with policymakers or local leaders, many of whom might be men and boys, and also sometimes trying to think about and meet the needs of male or forcibly displaced refugees. The other, I think what's interesting when you look at these very different settings, the important point was who are key stakeholders that have influence on the lived realities of refugee or displaced women and girls. So if you're, for instance, working in a refugee camp, it's probably going to be critical to think about access and buy-in by working with local camp leaders or figuring out the different humanitarian actors or state-mandated agencies to collaborate with. And then finally, kind of grantees recognize that, of course, when we talk about forcibly displaced and refugee women and girls, this is not a homogenous group. And we need to be aware of who is more likely vulnerable to violence based on taking an intersectional approach. And this was really important because many projects had demand that outstripped their capacity. And so having to be quite intentional of trying to reach those who are most vulnerable to violence, even within this subgroup. A few grantees mentioned that it was helpful to partner with other civil society organizations, maybe more specialized in taking an intersectional approach to do so. So for instance, one grantee in Malawi partnered with a disability rights organization to really more purposely engage refugee or displaced women and girls who are also living with a disability. And next slide, please. So there's some really valuable insights around strategies that grantees took to prevent and respond to violence against the subgroup. And again, I think this really comes back to a valuable contribution to the evidence gaps that I first discussed. So a lot of projects did incorporate awareness raising. And I think there's, discussion and emphasis that awareness raising on its own is unlikely to prevent violence. but it also can serve a really important need, in particular with working with refugee or displaced women and girls. So things like sometimes just being aware of what services exist for them and what are their rights, and that can change depending on the setting that they're in or maybe migrating to. What are their particular risk factors for violence in that setting? How can they mitigate that? And in some cases, especially projects that are more in transit or host settings, just updating migrants about policies around migration, different processes so they can make informed decisions. Many projects talked about the importance of addressing mental health and trauma needs of this subgroup, which is not surprising given the higher likelihood of being exposed to trauma or having poor mental health, and using different strategies for this, such as collective safe spaces or offering a group or individual counseling. Economic empowerment activities were a common strategy used, partly because many women and girls who are refugees or displaced are particularly disadvantaged socioeconomically, but also they're not potentially less able to access kind of state-supported funds or state, this came up, for instance, in the pandemic, that you might not be eligible if you didn't have legal status. There was also discussion of needing to tread this carefully, not wanting to create kind of situations of dependency, and also to monitor for any potential harm or backlash against women, especially with activities like emergency cash transfers. A few projects, very encouragingly, because I think you see less of this, especially in humanitarian settings, used community activism to try to shift some of the harmful norms underlying violence and that make this group more vulnerable to violence. And this really promisingly included to engage refugee or displaced women and girls themselves as activists. Finally, these are all prevention strategies, but across the portfolio, many of the grantees, really wanted to ensure access to services and justice alongside prevention, and the need for them to work really closely hand in hand. Similarly to thinking about barriers to engaging in programs, there was a lot of discussion around potential barriers for this group to access services and justice. So how to make sure that you are addressing those. So for instance, one strategy that was quite common was not just referring women and girls to services, but actually accompanying them. That can help minimize barriers, or things like one-stop services so that you can go to one place and have different needs met. Next slide, please. The third finding, and we've been hearing about these intersecting crises and really powerful discussion from practitioners earlier, was these projects are working amongst intersecting crises. And one of the, for instance, the kind of rapidly changing needs of refugee and displaced women and girls, or patterns of migration changing because of things from climate change, conflict, political crises, huge kind of external factors that could really require significant changes and challenges to grantees projects. A few grantees noted that
we have to wrap up really quickly.
Okay, sorry. Yes, okay. So just a few highlight here too is many projects were implemented during COVID, the early stages of the pandemic, which required adaptations, including things like filling in gaps for closure of state services, pivoting activities to online, focusing on how women and girls could minimize harm from the virus or related restrictions, and a stronger focus on economic empowerment. I'll just quickly, next slide, please, say one or two things about this finding. So many grantees noted that there are challenges hiring and retaining quality staff when working with refugee or displaced women and girls. This is because you're prone to working in insecure contexts and crises, as we've seen, but also prone to burnout, to vicarious trauma, and some of the mental health consequences since the pandemic were also emphasized. And so a lot of these projects emphasize the importance of self-care efforts for staff and having rigorous security protocols in place. And finally, the next finding, and that this is the end of my presentation. I know there's a lot to say, but the importance of enabling organizational preparedness and resilience. So flexible funding, especially for actors working with refugee and displaced women and girls, is critical. It allows them to respond to the typically fluctuating context and to also meet changing needs of this subgroup. And just the importance of donors to strike a balance between due diligence that is required when giving funding, but also being in touch with realities for these actors who are typically underfunded, overstretched, and working in very challenging contexts. So trying to kind of simplify reporting requirements as much as possible. Also, that core funding and longer term funding is really critical for these groups, especially given the challenges to access funding for women's rights organizations or civil society organizations in humanitarian settings. They commonly face implementation delays. And so really ensuring that longer term funding will allow them to use something to be mindful of when funding these groups. And just finally, I think really this synthesis review speaks to how important it is to be funding these actors to prevent violence against refugee and displaced women and girls. They tend to work very closely on the ground with a lot of them. They tend to be able to pivot to their realities and sometimes filling in kind of state gaps. And so thinking about how to build their capacities to continue to play this pivotal role. So I will end it there, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Erin, and sorry to have to cut it to time. I forgot to mention that Erin Stern is the Senior Associate with the Prevention Collaborative. Thank you for giving us some really valuable insights from the granting organizations. I think some of them, these things that you mentioned, emerged in our earlier discussion. Now, Marta will now take us through her findings and conclusions on the position and added value of the UN Trust Fund supported interventions in the HDP nexus. Marta Perez de Pulgar is gender and has a doctorate in gender and feminist studies, and she helped us with this report. Take it away, Marta.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the panelists. I mean, those from the grantees, it's so inspiring and it's so grounding, right, to see what all the work that you're doing and all the challenges you're facing. And also, Erin, it was so interesting to see how we have two separate studies, but they are so much aligned, although they were completely independent, which I think comes to show that we are really on the right track. So let's first look at what do today's crises look like, and what are their impacts on violence against women and girls? So Abigail earlier, as the chief of the Trust Fund, in her opening remarks, she did already highlight some of the key issues, and many elements and challenges have also come out and have been voiced by the panelists. Today's crises are increasingly long-lasting, recurring, complex, interdependent, and they are having cascading impacts. So we see displacement and vulnerability that are fueled by conflict, by climate change, by disasters, by health emergencies. We've seen the Ebola epidemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the issue is that these phenomena often happen simultaneously. We've seen on the 6th of February what happened with the Turkey-Syria earthquake. And for most Syrians, this earthquake only compounds existing suffering. 15th March will mark 12 years since the start of the conflict. And now they are facing these dire situations with massive damage and suffering due to the earthquake. Or we also see the cascading effects that the war in Ukraine is having on food crises in other countries. So addressing these intersecting crises will basically represent one of the largest humanitarian challenges in the years to come. Let's look at some figures that I have here for you. 25% of the global population lives in conflict-affected countries. Only in 2021, 235 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. In 2020, 95% of all conflict displacements occurred in countries that were vulnerable or highly vulnerable to climate change. And what are the implications of this? I mean, within this context, the short-term life-saving responses to crisis are becoming less and less efficient, right? And the distinction between the traditional humanitarian development actors is becoming blurry. And we need to work jointly together to reduce these growing inequality gaps. And these gaps include women's economic and political participation and preventing and responding to gender-based violence. Now, if we look at violence against women and girls in humanitarian settings, On one hand, we find massive gaps in gender data. And this makes it particularly difficult to monitor how crises are affecting women and girls. What are their perspectives? What are their strengths? What are their needs? But also, what are their barriers to participate in decision-making and to access assistance? Normally, women are portrayed as victims. And as Erin mentioned, women are not a homogeneous group. They have agency and they also have a lot to bring to the table. On the other hand, if we look at violence against women and girls, it's severely underreported. And the data we have does not really represent the true scale nor the true depth of violence against women and girls in this increasingly complex, longer and overlapping intersecting crisis. But we do know it's happening, and we therefore do not have to wait for the data to be available. We know it's happening. And what we also know is that women and girls continue to be disproportionately affected by humanitarian crises around the world. We do know that existing gender inequalities for women and girls are exacerbated during and after a crisis. And we also know that 70% of women experience gender-based violence in crisis setting, compared to 35% in non-crisis settings. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's now look at the funding landscape of eliminating violence against women and girls in humanitarian crisis and across the humanitarian development peace nexus. So first, looking at humanitarian pooled funds, the traditional humanitarian pooled funds, these are short-term in nature. Projects are not normally for 12 months or even less, which means that they really fall short when we're responding to the longer-term needs of the affected population. If we think about, or if we look at the decade from 2010 to 2019, more than half of humanitarian assistance went to countries with chronic crises lasting 10 or more years. However, funding mechanisms were funding 12 months or less projects. And while most of today's humanitarian financing is going to protracted situations, the funding remains low-term in nature. And what this leads to is basically that humanitarian needs remain underfunded and remain unmet. Let's look now at the grand bargain and the localization agenda, because it's really key to respond to these gaps that we have been observing. So the grand bargain, which was launched during the World Humanitarian Summit that took place in Istanbul in May 2016, around 7 years ago already, signatories committed to support multi-year funding and investments in the institutional capacities of local and national humanitarian actors, and to provide at least 25% of humanitarian funding as directly as possible to local and national responders. But in spite of the grand bargain commitments, what we're seeing is that humanitarian action is still not sufficiently localized. And in spite of the fact that we know that women rights organizations, women-led organizations, CSOs in general, and community groups are shouldering much of the crisis response in local communities, the funding to local women's organizations is significantly lacking, and that too often they are also left out from humanitarian decision-making. They have limited access to humanitarian and to other sources of funding. Just to give you an idea, and you will see it on the right side bottom of the slide, of the total bilateral aid, if we think about how much goes to women rights organizations in fragile countries, it's almost nothing. It's 0.2%. And the percentage has not changed in a whole decade. It's stagnated. So why does the grand bargain bring added value, or what does it have to do with ending violence against women and girls in crisis settings? Well, the study that was conducted and that is presented today found that there is donor interest in prioritizing gender-based violence in crisis settings, and that most bilateral donors actually are signatories of the grand bargain. However, what we see is that local women's rights and women-led organizations and women's activists and women's networks remain severely underfunded. And this has a capacity on their impact, and this has an impact on their capacity to engage in humanitarian coordination, to engage in planning, in implementation and monitoring, but also to influence decision-making. Some other figures that can showcase this: there was a study conducted in 2019, and it found that only 39% of gender-specific funding was covered, compared to 69% of overall appeal requests. It's almost half, right? And in addition to that, none of the existing pooled humanitarian funding mechanisms analyzed has been specifically designed to strengthen the capacities of women's rights or women-led organizations to operate in these complex intersecting crises, to address the impacts that the crises have on violence against women and girls. And this is where the trust fund's added value becomes critical and instrumental. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. So when we, next slide, sorry. Oh, sorry. Sorry, there should be, okay, doesn't matter. So when we look at the added value of the UN Trust Fund, what the study shows is that first, it brings long-term, flexible, and core funding to civil society and women's rights organizations. And as we have seen, most humanitarian funding mechanisms are short-term in nature, and they do not respond to the current protracted, longer-term complex humanitarian needs. And they are not directed to fund local CSOs or to fund women's organizations. And the Trust Fund provides this sustained support through longer-term investments for NGOs, but also to CSOs and to grassroots organizations to operate in crisis settings. Second, because the Trust Fund goes beyond funding and supporting large NGOs, and it actually brings an added value and pushes for a feminist localization agenda. It has existing relationships already built with women's rights organizations, and this positions the Trust Fund to build on its experience, on its learnings, and on the results achieved to push forward the feminist localization agenda towards ending violence against women and girls in complex and protracted crises. Third, because it enables to navigate the humanitarian development peace nexus to end violence against women and girls. Because many CSOs and women's rights organizations are already operating in high-risk contexts and in longer-term crises. So in this context, the fact that the Trust Fund provides these organizations, many of you are here today, the fact that the Trust Fund provides long-term and flexible core funding is an enabler to be able to pivot and navigate the humanitarian development peace nexus to end violence against women and girls before, during, and after crisis. And fourthly, because the Trust Fund, by investing in preparedness and resilience, it enables civil society organizations and women's rights organizations to be better equipped to participate in decision-making and coordination in case of crisis, better equipped to ensure accountability with existing humanitarian commitments, with existing humanitarian standards and policies that, although they are there, civil society organizations and women's organizations are being systematically left out and underfunded. It enables the organizations to be better equipped to increase support to local actors, and this came out in one of the presentations earlier, to provide support to local actors and communities by working with women's organizations, and because the Trust Fund enables civil society organizations and women's organizations to strengthen local accountability systems and mechanisms and to foster community engagement. The study has a lot more information in it, but in conclusion, it does come to demonstrate that prioritizing and investing in efforts to eliminate violence against women and girls in today's increasingly complex and protracted crisis is essential. And as we have seen, the Trust Fund is uniquely positioned to support the CSOs and the women's rights organizations in pushing the agenda forward in this type of context to end violence against women and girls. And I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marta. Martha just gave us the summarized version of her findings. The link is on the chat. Our colleagues dropped the link there if you want to read it. So that was a summarized version of her findings that have informed the UN Trust Fund's latest call for proposals in both mainstreaming preparedness as well as organizational resilience, and shedding light on contexts of protracted crisis where women and girls experience increased risks of violence and abuse. And from the UN Trust Fund, I have to say I'm very proud of the efforts that we've made in trying to understand the realities faced by women's rights organizations on the ground, and the initiatives we've introduced during this last few years to address some of those issues like long-term funding, flexibility, self-care, contingency funding, all part of what Marta spoke about and what Erin spoke about. And now it is my pleasure to hand things over to my colleague, Marie Palitzin. She's going to take us through a rapid presentation of the analysis of the demand which emerged from civil society organizations through our recently concluded call for proposal. Marie, take it away.
Thank you very much. So the 26th UN Trust Fund Call for Proposal focus on ending violence against most marginalized women and girls and strengthening organizational preparedness and resilience in order to support civil society organizations to address violence against women before and once a crisis hits, with 3-year funding. The UN Trust Fund received 1,609 applications from 113 countries for a total value of $756 million. Compared to last year, it's a 15% increase in the number of applications. And this year, based on the findings of a study just presented by Marta, and with the aim to support crisis-affected women and girls and women's rights organizations working in crisis settings, we included a special focus on protected crises. Under this special focus, we received a total of 364 applications from 62 countries and for a total value of $178 million. And this was 23% of all the applications received. And I will now focus and present some of the data on this application we received under the special focus. So with regard to the geographical distribution, as you can see on the map, the majority of applications were received from the Africa region, and that's 58% of the application received, followed by Asia and the Pacific, 20%, and Arab states and North Africa, 12%. In Europe and Central Asia, a small number of applications were received, only 7% of the application, and a third of those applications from the ECA region were from Ukraine. The lowest number of applications were received from Latin America, only 1% of the application received. And the 3 countries with the most applications are Nigeria, South Sudan, and Kenya. As it relates to the type of organization we have applied, almost half of the applicants identified as women's rights organization, 48%. And more humanitarian organizations applied under the special focus compared to the general window. It was 17% of humanitarian organizations applying under the special focus. With regard to the focus of applications, almost half of the application focus on the provision of essential services, while another 44% focus on the prevention of violence, and a smaller number of applications focused on laws and policies, 7%. In terms of the forms of violence targeted, a majority of applications stated intimate partner violence, followed by harmful practices and sexual violence by non-partner violence. Application under the special focus targeted more sexual violence and gender-based violence in crisis settings, 26% of the application compared to 10% under the general window. And they targeted also more sexual and gender-based violence in refugee internally displaced person camps, 18% compared to 8%. Finally, concerning the beneficiaries, the most targeted beneficiaries under the special focus were women and girl survivors of violence, representing 72%, followed by women and girls in the lowest income group, 62%, and women and girls with disability, 54%. Under the special focus, more application targeted women and girl refugee or internally displaced, 52% of applications compared to 30% under the general window. And they targeted also more women and girl survivors of violence. 72% of the application chose to target those beneficiaries compared to 63% in the general window. So that's a very rapid overview of the applications we have received under the special focus this year. I'm done, Lorna.
Oh, thank you so much, Marie, for that. So with our last presenter, Marie, that concludes the presentation portion this morning and brings us back now to the discussion segment. We had originally set aside 20 minutes for this, but we're running low on time now. So we're just going to ask our panelists to please be brief in their responses. We did have some questions come in, and so I'm going to ask them, and please try to be brief in your responses. So the first question we are going to ask Kevin. It's on Afghanistan. Kevin, what strategies are you using in Afghanistan to convince the Taliban to reinstate the women's services that were originally in place, like the referral services and the referral pathways?
Thank you, Lorna. The truth of the matter is the decision that was made by the Taliban to disallow women from going to work and from girls attending school. There's no inherent logic in it. And I think a segment of the Taliban understands that that is not a viable and sustainable solution for a country that is war-torn and is in sheer ruins in terms of its economy. So what we have done, we have tried to work with the authorities, going to them, having meetings, trying to make them see the advantages of including women in different segments. Now, I have to say that the decision to ban women from participation in civil society has come from the top, but there is some sympathy that we have in local circles of the de facto authorities, and we try to work with them. For example, they understand that you cannot provide services to women in the healthcare system if there are no female doctors present. Midwives cannot be men, so you have to have female midwives attending to women. The same thing is true about certain segments that require women in terms of education, in terms of some of the counseling. So we try to persuade them to look at it from a different point of view. In some cases, we succeed. In some cases, we don't. But lastly, I want to say that the biggest strength of the movement has come from the solidarity of the entire civil society in Afghanistan, and from the fact that the international donors have stood side by side by the Afghan civil society and keep telling the Taliban that we are not going to sit silent and watch this horror show unfold. And I think the Taliban ultimately has registered that this is not sustainable for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the donors are not going to make peace with this. So I think a whole host of negotiation from on the local level, and then the pressure from the international community, hopefully can bring a change to this very ill-advised decision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that. And now we have another question that came in, and perhaps we can ask Lizette to address this question. Somebody is asking, I'm curious to know if there are any standard trauma therapy counseling used to address the trauma, mental health issues of the survivors that you work with. So maybe you could share some of these standard trauma therapy or counseling strategies or resources that you are aware of, Lisette.
Claro. Bueno, yo
Of
soy
course.
abogada.
I'm a lawyer, and so it's somewhat difficult for me to talk about psychological matters, but I can do my best. We have two different ways of working. Psychologists work from a psychosocial perspective. It is my understanding that the clinical work is related to the individuals and their internal problems. But here, psychologists work from a psychosocial perspective. And what that means is that they basically deal with these issues from group dynamics, from links and communications and interrelationships among individuals who come together with a shared objective. throughout the asylum process, the women have a weekly space to talk to the psychologists about what they have gone through in their country of origin, but also what they are going through in Mexico that is affecting them. And we also have other support groups. We have a very interesting one where women come together to bake bread. So as they are getting ready to bake their bread, or while they are actually baking the bread, they are talking about matters of violence and how it impacts them, how it affects them, and what tools they have to face that violence. And we talk about their rights in terms of their access to justice rights while the bread is baking. And so that creates sorority and support, where these women seek to support one another during their migrant process. And this is all accompanied by a psychologist. And yes, the psychologists are very experienced on violence and trauma. And we do have a clinical intervention model that maybe if you provide an email address, I can email much more detailed information about it to share.
Thank you very much, Lisette. And last question we have, maybe Hala can answer for maybe 2 minutes. I know that your program works also a little bit with men and boys. So there is a question here about interventions that engage with men and boys from a psychosocial approach as persons affected by displacement or conflict as well. So maybe perhaps you can say something about what your findings are, your work with men on the EVOL side.
I think, first of all, it's really very important, to think very critically about the engagement with men and boys during crisis time when it comes to issues of violence against women. So it's not, and this is something that often that donor agencies, they approach it as an extra ingredient that has to be added to violence against women projects, and it shouldn't be that way. It should be contextualized, and women on the ground should actually have clear reflections in terms of how do they see, and when do they see the engagement of men and boys is important and beneficial, in terms of reducing incidents of violence against women and girls. And we have a lot of trust of the women activists on the grounds and their decisions, and their capacity to negotiate, when and how to engage men and boys in addressing and challenging violence against women and girls. And I know there is plenty of strategies and methodologies. And I always feel that there is constantly a need to re-examine and evaluate the impact of those strategies, particularly during crisis times. Having said that, I think, when you allow the women themselves to take the lead, there is way more success, in terms of establishing allies among the men and boys in the community. Yeah.
Thank you, Hala. So I guess, we still have to center it around the women who are our main beneficiaries or our main partners in this project when we work with men and boys. So unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. We only had time for 3 questions. And now I will thank you so much to everyone, all the presenters that we had this morning. And now I will hand it over to Abby for our closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. And thank you so much, everyone. I really want to acknowledge Hala, Lizeth, and Kevin. I would like to acknowledge all of you for sharing, such powerful contributions, and also, the incredible work of your organizations in these very challenging times. So really just want to, just say thank you so much for being here today. Also, thank you to our other speakers for sharing perspectives and findings from the UN Trust Fund evaluations. I mean, the state of funding play when we look at the humanitarian context, and obviously also the really interesting data around our call for proposals, which was in direct response to the complex times that we find ourselves in, and a real intentionality of supporting women's rights organizations in protracted crises. I think it's really important for me as the incoming chief of the trust fund to really just reiterate and emphasize and amplify our deep commitment to continued collaboration, mutual empowerment, and partnership in learning with all of you, with our civil society and women's rights organization partners. We see you, we know the importance and critical role that you play in transformational change in your communities and in your countries, and even regionally and globally. And I just want to really amplify and highlight that point. There are so many key takeaways from the discussion, and obviously, I don't have a lot of time, but I think just a couple of things I want to pull out from what I heard. I really, it really resonated with me, the message around that power of international solidarity and partnerships, and that kind of importance of the deep and unwavering commitment to women's rights and women's rights organizations, and however we can do that, right? That comes out in different ways from the international community, from our local women's rights organizations, and from other partners. But I really heard that, and I think linked to that also is the real critical importance of entities like the Trust Fund and others in supporting civil society and women's rights and other social justice and rights movement building on their/your terms. So that came out really clearly to me. I think also, and I think Hala, I think all of you mentioned this, Hala, Kevin, Lizeth, just the continual and unwavering support that we need to provide to grassroots women's organizations. And also, I really was thinking about the influence and impact of grassroots local organizations within their sphere of influence, for example, with local authorities, versus necessarily national actors. But I think that support, connection, and leadership of grassroots women's rights organizations, as we all know, I mean, they are the leaders of social change and transformational change in their communities and in their countries. And that needs to be linked back to decision making at every single level. So even that point around when and how do we engage with men and boys, it's not a tick box. This has to be really thought through. And we need to ensure that the kind of locus of power and decision making is sitting with civil society, women's rights organizations. I think the last thing I would say, and this is something that myself, being in the field for 20 years, including the humanitarian field, would say always, is we have to put our money where our mouth is. You can see how woefully underfunded gender work is across the board, and specifically addressing violence against women and girls. And I think that as a collective, community, an international community, donor partners and, of course, entities like the Trust Fund need to be able to advocate and resource for women's rights work and women's rights organizations for the change that we all want to see, and for the progress towards SDGs at a very, kind of big picture level. Just finally to say, for 27 years, the mission of the Trust Fund to end all forms of violence against women and girls has not changed. That continues to be the primary focus of everything that we do at the Trust Fund. And that will not stop until we have a world where women and girls are valued and safe everywhere. We are so grateful to have the trust and partnership with you, with activist organizations, with feminist networks, as well as other government, private sector, donor partners. So together we can leverage more spaces for meaningful engagement and more resources for the resilience and the growth of civil society and women's rights organizations who are meeting backlash at every step and in every place across the world. I really hope that you found today's webinar and panel discussions insightful. I thank each one of you for the work that you do every day to end violence against all women and girls. And we really look forward to continuing these discussions with you so that we can improve our collective work and strengthen our voices for women and girls everywhere. So once again, thank you so much. Thanks for engaging in the events. Thank you so much to our incredible partners that we work with, and for being here today. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Over to you, Lorna.
So again, thank you. Thank you very much to everyone. I think that brings us to the end. We will continue to listen to each other and support each other, so that we can move forward with eliminating violence against women and girls. Thank you so much, everyone.